Hello, everyone, and thank you very much for coming today, and thank you so much to the conference organizers for inviting me to speak. It's always great to participate in any event at Georgetown, and I'm particularly honored to be speaking to you before you'll hear from one of my longest and most important political heroes, Daniel Ellsberg. It's really kind of remarkable to me how to think about how we think now about what Daniel Ellsberg has done in light of how we think about more contemporary examples that are really quite similar. One of the reasons why Daniel Ellsberg became my political hero is because I remember when I was growing up and sort of 9, 10, 11, 12 years old, I became obsessed with things like All the President's Men and the entire Nixon era. And the fact that there was somebody who stood in such a brave and dissident posture to the prevailing orthodoxies of that time, and who did so by sacrificing all of his liberty, was always something that was so remarkable to me and had this great allure to me, even when I was too young to understand exactly what made it so significant. And one of the things that I think we don't fully appreciate about Daniel Ellsberg is that he came extremely close to spending the rest of his life in prison. I think there's almost no question, and I bet you that he himself would agree, that if he were to do what he did back then now, he probably would spend the rest of his life in prison. I think it's inconceivable to imagine an American court in the post 9/11 era dismissing a criminal indictment, which it otherwise views as valid, because of wrongdoing on the part of the executive branch. Perhaps if you stretch the contours of your imagination, you could envision a federal court speaking critically of some action taken by the president. Even that, just uttering criticism of the president, is almost impossible to imagine given how incredibly subservient the U.S. judiciary has become in the post 9/11 era. But it's impossible to envision that criticism, even if it were to happen, translating into the dismissal of charges against somebody who has been accused by the U.S. government of endangering American national security and engaging in espionage. And I think if Daniel Ellsberg had done what he did in 2011 or 2001 rather than 1971, he would certainly have spent his life in prison. And that's what makes his sacrifice so incredibly remarkable, that he brought information that he believed in his good conscience the public should know, even knowing it might send him to prison forever. And what I find really fascinating to do, and I've done this a lot actually in the past 10 months, is to understand what actually was said about Daniel Ellsberg, not now when it's easy to praise him, but back in 1971 and 1972. And I've been able to do this in part because I've had the great fortune of becoming friends with Daniel Ellsberg. I sit on the board of the Freedom of the Press Foundation with him, and so he's my colleague as well. And I've had the opportunity to speak to him a lot about that time period. But if you can just go back and look through Google and other research means, as I've done as well, to what was being said contemporaneously about the leaking of the Pentagon Papers, and it's radically different from what is said now. At the time, he was widely vilified as somebody who had recklessly violated his oath, who had broken the law and committed felonies, who had put the men of the American military, and to a far lesser extent than now the women of the American military, in harm's way, and was even accused continuously by people like John Ehrlichman and others of being a Russian spy, of being an agent for the Kremlin. Essentially, everything that is said now about Edward Snowden and other whistleblowers was said virtually down to the letter of the script about Daniel Ellsberg 40 years ago. And history has vindicated Daniel Ellsberg in such a way that almost nobody is willing to stand up in public any longer and contest the fact that what he did was noble and heroic. It's really remarkable, given how much vindication he has received. And I know this because when I engage in debates about Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning, and I invoke Daniel Ellsberg and what he did, and mention the fact that he has become their most ardent advocates, he has lavished praise on both Manning and Snowden, calling them heroes and saying he waited 40 years for someone to be brave enough to do what they did. Nobody responds to that, including the most aggressive NSA defenders, by saying, well, I don't agree with you that what Daniel Ellsberg did either is heroic and noble. Everybody has to accept that premise because it's become orthodoxy that what he did was justified, and they try instead to distinguish what Ellsberg did from what Snowden and Manning did, something that is made very difficult, a task that's very difficult by the fact that Ellsberg himself says the acts are identical. But it wasn't that way at the time. And I think that the reason for that is that when a whistleblower comes forward and brings transparency to the most powerful factions, which is what whistleblowers do, the nature of a faction being powerful is that it has extremely influential defenders and loyalists and apologists. And the function of those defenders and apologists and spokespeople, whether they're working directly for the government or parading around and masquerading as journalists or simply people who are devoted to the party in power, is that they not only defend those who wield power, but they attack and try and demonize anybody who challenges or threatens to undermine the people who wield that power. And that's why whistleblowers are instantly attacked and demonized the way that Daniel Ellsberg was back then. Once enough time passes, the incentive to demonize that person dissipates because the people whom it undermined no longer wield power. And then we can all acknowledge and admit that what that person did was actually courageous and heroic and noble. And I have zero doubt, that 30 years from now, when nobody has an interest in devoting themselves to defending Barack Obama and his top-level national security officials, or prior to him defending George Bush and his top national security officials because they no longer wield power and they're historic figures of the past, that the acts of the whistleblowers of our generation, most notably Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden, but others who have been persecuted quite harshly for far more restrained acts, such as Thomas Drake and Jezelyn Raddick and others, will be regarded exactly as Daniel Ellsberg's acts, which is as an act of nobility and self-sacrifice in pursuit of legitimate goals of transparency and accountability. I want to talk a little bit about why whistleblowing of the type engaged in by Ellsberg 40 years ago and then Manning and Snowden today are justifiable. Because sometimes people will say, in fact, often people will say, who want to criticize the acts of Edward Snowden and Chelsea Manning and other whistleblowers, nobody likes to stand up in public and say, I'm opposed to transparency, or I'm against whistleblowers. Nobody ever wants to say that. They like to pretend that they're actually in favor of transparency and defenders of whistleblowers, even if they want to attack all the people who bring transparency and engage in whistleblowing. And so the tactic that they use is they pretend that they favor whistleblowing when done in a more responsible manner, that there are systems within the government that are set up to accommodate whistleblowers, that if you are working inside the government and discover that something has been done that's wrong, there are responsible ways to bring this to the attention of overseers or courts or the public without simply running to journalists and handing over large amounts of information that the government has said should be kept secret. And the reason why that's, I think, such a deceitful and damaging proposition is grounded in the nature of what transparency was supposed to do. If you go back and read just the basic writings of the American founders, which I think we don't do nearly enough of, what we find is, of course, that the central project of the founders was to figure out a way out of their dilemma. Their dilemma was that they wanted to create a new centralized government that would exercise great power, all the power that you need to vest in a government for it to be a functioning government. The power to raise taxes, to assemble a military, to pass laws, to put people in cages, to take their property, to do all the things that government necessarily has to have the power to do to be a properly functioning government. But the question was, how do you create a institution that vests human beings with all those powers without replicating all of the abuse of power that they had just waged this incredibly risky and difficult war to free themselves from? And their central answer, of course, was that power can be reasonably exercised, and we can trust human beings to exercise that kind of power only if there are very robust checks and limits on how that power is exercised. And they created various institutions that were designed to check the exercise of that power to ensure that those abuses were difficult. And one of the primary tools that these institutions were supposed to have was the power of transparency, based in the understanding that human beings were willing to abuse their power, or at least far more willing to abuse their power if they could do so in the dark without anyone knowing than they would if the light was shown on what it was that they were doing. And the problem is that the institutions that were created and protected to bring transparency and to limit that abuse of power are the very institutions that have most radically failed, especially in the post-9/11 era. So you have Congress that, instead of bringing transparency and imposing checks on what the intelligence community and the military are doing, have done everything to shield those activities from scrutiny, have done everything to legitimize and endorse their abuses. You have the American media that, instead of being an adversarial check on that power and investigating it, have become its greatest cheerleaders, the ones who lead the way calling for those who bring transparency. You have the court system, which in my view has been the most shamefully failed in the post-9/11 era, the institution that was supposed to protect basic rights and ensure transparency, even when doing so is most politically unpopular, which is why they were shielded with life tenure, that has become as subservient to the U.S. government, especially when it claims that there's national security at stake, as any institution we've ever seen. And so all of these institutions haven't just failed in their function to impose checks and accountability through transparency. They've done the opposite. They've actually emboldened and strengthened and enabled the regime of secrecy that enables this systematic abuse of power. And so one of the very few ways, in fact, I would argue the principal way that we have learned about government abuses over the last decade, whether it be the abuses at Abu Ghraib or at Guantanamo or in the rendition program or in the torture program, or through NSA warrantless eavesdropping, or through the collected all NSA regime, has been not through any of these institutions that were designed to provide checks, but has been through people of conscience in the government who could not allow this information to remain secret any longer, and against the mandates of law, but in accordance with their own oath to the Constitution and their conscience, have decided to risk their own liberty to bring this information to light and make sure the public learns about it. It's really the sole avenue that we have left to enable there to be meaningful checks on those who wield the greatest power. And that's precisely why we have seen what I think everybody across the political spectrum recognizes is this unprecedented war on whistleblowers. The fact that they have been prosecuted under the Espionage Act in greater numbers than all previous administrations combined under the Obama administration, that there has been this chill, this fear that has been deliberately imposed on the source-journalist relationship to prevent this kind of disclosure from taking place, precisely because it's one of the few, if not the only effective avenue remaining for understanding what the government is doing and for imposing limits on those in power. And the way that you know that it's one of the few effective means is the fact that it's being so vindictively and aggressively attacked, and that's the reason that it is. And so this idea that Edward Snowden or Chelsea Manning could have brought their materials to people in Congress and obtained accountability that way is simply misleading on its face. And one great way to see that is to look at the actions of even those powerful senators who sit on the Intelligence Committee who have been critics of the NSA, namely Ron Wyden and Mark Udall, two Democratic senators on the Intelligence Committee who knew about all of these NSA abuses, who understood that they were dangerous, who wanted the American public to learn about them, who actually ran around the country for 3 years winking and hinting and doing everything they can to imply and suggest that something was very awry in the U.S. surveillance state. They were saying things like, the Obama administration is interpreting the Patriot Act in ways that are so radical that Americans would, quote, be stunned to learn about what it was that was being done under these theories. And yet Americans didn't learn about what was being done because Mark Udall and Ron Wyden lacked the courage to do what they should have done, which is gone to the floor of the Senate and invoked the immunity that the Constitution gives them and revealed this information. They were too interested in keeping their power and prestige within official Washington, and so they hinted and winked that these things should be disclosed, but they took no steps to disclose it themselves. It took Edward Snowden to come forward to journalists and, with great risk to himself, reveal this information because he saw that most of the entities that exist within the government that are supposedly designed to enable whistleblowers to bring incriminating information to the public are actually designed to do the opposite, which is to stifle it and muffle it and to make sure it doesn't see the light of day, and saw that even the very few political officials who do view these programs as menacing were limited and constrained by both the law and their own cowardice to bring it to light. And so the only choice that he had for bringing these things to light is exactly what it is that he did, which is meeting with journalists who he knew had reported aggressively and would then publicly disclose it. And that's what makes the act of whistleblowing so remarkable. I think, in general, what that really underscores is that there has been a climate of fear deliberately created by the United States government to prevent exactly the transparency and accountability and checks and limits that the founders understood was so central to a healthy and functioning republic. You don't need to have a government that rounds up thousands or even hundreds of journalists and puts them in prison if you have just a handful of cases where journalists are clearly being threatened with criminal prosecution for the reporting that they've done. One of America's greatest investigative journalists, Jim Risen, who exposed the NSA warrantless eavesdropping program in 2006 and reported on a whole variety of other systemic abuses within the American intelligence community, is being threatened with prison right now because of the reporting that he did and his refusal to tell the U.S. government who his sources are. The journalists who have worked on the Snowden revelations, including myself, have been repeatedly called criminals, not by fringe figures like Peter King only, but by the top national security officials in the U.S. government, including James Clapper and Mike Rogers and Keith Alexander. And the point of this is to make certain that journalists face the same mindset as whistleblowers. Whistleblowers are supposed to look at the string of people who have been prosecuted, at what was done to Chelsea Manning, a 35-year prison term, being forced to stand naked in her jail cell, abused and subjected to treatment that the UN found was inhumane and cruel, as a way of telling whistleblowers, if you are going to think in the future about disclosing what it is that we've done in the dark that was incriminating, think twice. Look at what it is that we've done to all of these other whistleblowers. That, too, is what they're trying to do now to journalists, to say, if you want to report on things that we've done, that we have formally said should remain a secret, look at how we're able to threaten even somebody like Jim Risen, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter with the New York Times, or these other journalists in the Snowden case. Look at how we can threaten them with prison, put them in fear of what it is that we can do to them, and you too should think twice, at least in the back of your minds, about whether or not this is what you want to do. They're relying on a climate of fear, the same climate of fear that was established by dressing people up in orange jumpsuits and putting them in shackles and putting them on an island in the middle of an ocean thousands of miles from their home and imprisoning them for over a decade without trials or torturing people. All of this is a way of sending a signal that we, the U.S. government, can operate without any accountability, without limits on what it is that we can do to those who challenge us. And I think one of the central purposes, the goals of the reporting we've done in the Snowden case has been to defy that climate of fear, to say that there are certain rights that we have under the Constitution, a right to a free press, a right to free speech, a right not to be imprisoned without due process, a right to have transparency and accountability for our highest political officials, that we're going to insist upon even in the face of your threats. And it's one of the reasons why I have great optimism, despite all of these trends, to increase the powers of secrecy, to punish whistleblowers and journalists, to erode civil liberties, is because there are so many people who are increasingly devoted to the idea that these basic rights need to be defended. And I think conferences like this, where we gather and we talk about the importance of civil liberties and privacy, the threats posed by secrecy, hearing from people like Daniel Ellsberg who have lived and led by example, are so vital, because I do think that the more people who get emboldened about defending these core liberties and the need for transparency and accountability, the harder it is for these abuses to continue unchecked. So with that, I thank you again for convening this conference, for inviting me here to speak, and for attending as well. Thanks very much.